mean I'll see it.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around how any of this is possible, and honestly, the more I think about it, the more I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality. I moved to the city back in early spring, and for the first few months, I was completely alone. It's a cold, gray place where people don't really look you in the eye. That changed when I met Dax. We were both working at this dive bar called the Rusty Anchor, a place that always smelled like stale beer and wet sawdust. Dax was already there when I started, or at least, that's how I remember it. He was the kind of guy who just fit in everywhere, lean, with a messy mop of dark hair and this sharp, cynical sense of humor that made the long shifts go by faster. For 2 years, we were basically attached at the hip. If I wasn't at the bar pulling pints with him, we were at some underground show or grabbing late-night greasy food at the diner down the street. I remember the way he'd lean against the back alley brick wall during our smoke breaks, the orange glow of his cigarette lighting up his face as he told me stories about growing up in some nowhere town out west. He had this specific way of laughing, a dry, raspy sound that always followed a particularly mean joke about one of our regulars. We had a rhythm. I'd prep the garnishes, he'd restock the cakes. We split tips right down the middle every single night. I have clear, vivid memories of him handing me a wad of crumpled singles and saying, "Don't spend it all on records, man." Everything changed on a random afternoon. It was a shift like any other, but Dax didn't show up. That wasn't like him. He was the kind of guy who showed up for work even when he was deathly ill because he needed the cash. I waited 20 minutes, then 30. I tried calling his cell, but I got that flat, robotic recording saying the number was no longer in service. That was the first spike of unease in my gut. I figured maybe he dropped his phone or finally forgot to pay the bill, so I finished the shift alone, feeling annoyed that I had to do the work of 2 people. The next morning, I went to his apartment. It was an old, crumbling brownstone in a neighborhood where the streetlights were always smashed. I'd been there a dozen times. I knew the creak of the 3rd step on the landing and the way the hallway smelled like boiled cabbage and floor wax. I knocked on his door, for B, but there was no answer. I kept knocking until the landlord, a bloated man with a stained undershirt, came shuffling out of the basement. I asked him if he'd seen the guy in 4B. The landlord stared at me with these milky, suspicious eyes and told me I was full of it. He said that unit had been vacant for nearly 8 months because of a burst pipe and a mold infestation that he hadn't bothered to fix yet. He even pulled out his keys and shoved the door open to prove it. The room was gutted. There was no furniture, no posters of the bands we liked, no pile of dirty laundry in the corner. Just strips of peeling wallpaper and a thick, suffocating layer of gray dust over everything. The air in there felt stagnant and dead, like it hadn't been breathed in years. I stood in the middle of the empty floor, looking at the spot where I remembered his couch being, and I felt a wave of coldness wash over me that made my skin crawl. I went straight to the bar, thinking maybe he just had some kind of breakdown and the landlord was crazy. I found my boss, Miller, in the back office counting the previous night's take. I asked him for Dax's emergency contact info from his file. Miller stopped counting, his thumb frozen on a $20 bill. He looked up at me, and the expression on his face wasn't one of confusion, it was genuine concern, the kind you give to someone who's having a public stroke. He told me he didn't know who I was talking about. He told me that for the last year, I'd been the only bartender on the roster for that shift. He said he'd been worried about me lately because I'd started talking to myself while I worked, like I was having a full-on conversation with someone who wasn't there. I felt the blood drain from my face. I told him he was joking, that Dax had been there last night, that we'd split the tips. Miller just shook his head and pulled up the payroll on his computer. My name was the only one there. He even pulled up the security footage from 2 nights ago. I watched the grainy, flickering screen. I saw myself behind the bar, moving back and forth. I saw myself reach out and hand a drink to a customer, then turn to my left and start laughing. I was looking directly at the empty space where Dax should have been. I watched myself grab a handful of bills from the jar and hold them out into the air. The money just stayed in my hand for a second before I shoved the whole lot into my own pocket. I looked insane. I looked like I was trapped in a dance with a ghost. I ran home and grabbed my phone. I had hundreds of photos of us. I scrolled back to a concert we went to last summer. There I was, standing in front of the stage, my arm draped over nothing. My shoulder was dipped as if resting on someone's weight, my hand curled around an invisible shoulder. In every single photo, it was the same thing. Me at the diner, sitting across from an empty booth with 2 plates of food. Me at the park, grinning at the empty space beside me. But then I started looking closer at the pictures, and that's when the real horror set in. In the background of one photo, a selfie we took at a dive bar, I could see our reflection in a mirror behind us. In the reflection, there was no one next to me, but there was something else. Down by my feet, there was a shadow that didn't match mine. It was a long, distorted shape that looked like a man stretched out of proportion, his fingers elongated like spindly, dark needles. I started checking my apartment, really looking at things for the first time. I found a jacket in the back of my closet that didn't belong to me. It was a heavy, dark denim, and when I picked it up, a wave of a foul, cloying stench hit me, not like anything natural, but the thick, overwhelming scent of meat that's been sitting in the sun for a week, mixed with something sharp and chemical. It made my throat seize up. I reached into the pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper. It was a receipt from the diner, dated 2 days ago. At the bottom, in a cramped, shaky handwriting that wasn't mine, were the words, "Those who are seen are never free." I haven't slept in 48 hours. I keep hearing that dry, raspy laugh coming from the hallway, but when I look, there's nothing but the shadows shifting under the door. The worst part isn't that I might be crazy. The worst part is the physical evidence. I looked in the bathroom mirror this morning and saw a bruise on my shoulder, the clear, distinct purple marks of 5 long, thin fingers where someone had gripped me too hard. I checked my bank account, and there are withdrawals I don't remember making, payments to a name I don't recognize. And then I found the video on my phone. It's a 3-second clip, likely a pocket dial or an accident. It's dark, mostly black, but you can hear breathing. It's not my breathing. It's a wet, rattling sound, like someone's lungs are filled with fluid. And just before the clip ends, a voice whispers my name. It's Dax's voice, but it sounds wrong, like the words are being forced through a throat filled with broken glass. I'm sitting in my living room now, and the air feels incredibly stagnant, like the oxygen is being sucked out of the room by something massive sitting right next to me. I can see the cushion on the armchair beside me slowly depressing, sinking down as if someone is sitting there, watching me type this. I can't look. I know if I look, I'll see that empty space, and the empty space is more terrifying than any monster I could imagine. I feel a faint, cold pressure against my arm, like a hand resting there in a gesture of friendship. I think he's waiting for me to say something. I think he's waiting for me to acknowledge him again so he can come back.
Next story.
I spent an entire semester living in a cramped, cinder-block dorm room with a girl named Sarah. To be honest, I didn't even like her that much. She was one of those roommates who just didn't understand personal space. Her side of the room was always a disaster zone of half-eaten takeout containers, discarded hoodies, and textbooks that looked like they'd been through a lawnmower. She had this annoying habit of playing lo-fi beats at 2 a.m. while she studied, the bass vibrating through my pillow just enough to keep me in that miserable state between awake and asleep. We fought constantly. Mostly it was about the dishes. We had this tiny kitchenette, and she would let bowls of cereal sit until the milk turned into a thick, yellowish crust. I remember one specific Tuesday. I can still feel the heat of the anger in my chest, where I yelled at her for nearly 20 minutes because she'd used my expensive shampoo. She just sat there on her unmade bed, twisting a strand of her greasy blonde hair around her finger, staring at me with those vacant, washed-out blue eyes. She didn't even apologize. She just shrugged and said I was being dramatic. That was our dynamic. Constant, low-level friction. I saw her every single day. I heard her snoring. I smelled her cheap coconut perfume. I even walked in on her changing once and apologized for the awkwardness. She was as real as the floor beneath my feet. When winter break rolled around, I couldn't wait to get away from her. I packed my bags and headed home without even saying goodbye. She was sitting at her desk, staring at a blank Word document, the blue light of the screen making her skin look sickly and gray. That was the last time I saw her in that room. I came back 3 weeks later, lugging my suitcase up 3 flights of stairs. I unlocked the door to room 3B, expecting to be hit by the smell of her old laundry and the sound of her music. But the room was dead silent. I pushed the door open and stopped dead. Sarah's side of the room wasn't just clean, it was empty. There was no bed frame, no desk, no posters of 90s horror movies she loved. Even the dust seemed to have been scrubbed away. The mattress was a bare, clinical blue plastic. I figured she'd finally flunked out or moved into an apartment with some friends she'd mentioned. I felt a massive sense of relief. I went down to the RA's office, a girl named Maya who I'd seen a dozen times in the halls. I told her I was checking in and asked when Sarah had moved out so I could figure out if I was getting a new roommate. Maya looked at me with a confused expression. She pulled up the housing spreadsheet on her laptop and scrolled down to the 3rd floor. She shook her head and told me there must be a mistake. She said that according to the records, I had been assigned a single room back in August because of a shortage in the freshman intake. She told me I'd been living alone the entire semester. I laughed. I thought she was pulling some kind of weird prank. I told her that was impossible, that I'd been arguing with Sarah about her dirty dishes for 4 months. Maya didn't laugh back. Her face went pale, and she leaned in, asking me if I was feeling okay. She said she'd walked past my room dozens of times and the door was always open, and she never saw anyone in there but me. She said she used to hear me talking, but she thought I was just on the phone or maybe talking to myself to cope with the stress of finals. I felt a cold, leaden weight settle in the pit of my stomach. My heart started thudding against my ribs, a slow, suffocating beat. I pulled out my phone. I had hundreds of photos. I was an Instagram addict back then, constantly posting stories of my dorm life. I told Maya I'd prove it. I opened my archived stories from October. I found a video I'd taken when I was complaining about Sarah's mess. In my memory, the video showed me panning the camera over to Sarah, who was flipping me off while sitting amidst a pile of trash. I hit play. The audio was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't the sound of my voice and her music. It was silence. A deep, pressurized silence that felt like it was crushing my eardrums. In the video, I'm talking, my lips are moving, but no sound is coming out. Then I panned the camera to Sarah's side of the room. The bed was empty. The desk was empty. But there was something there. In the spot where Sarah should have been sitting, there was a blurry, jagged distortion in the air. It looked like heat rising off a highway, a shimmering, translucent shape that vaguely mimicked the silhouette of a person. It didn't have a face, but as the camera lingered, the distortion seemed to ripple, as if it were aware it was being recorded. I scrolled through more photos. In every single one, she wasn't there. There was just that smudge, that glitch in reality. In a photo from Halloween where we were supposed to be posing together, I'm holding my arm out as if it's draped over someone's shoulder, but my hand is just hovering in midair, clutching nothing but empty space. I felt sick. I ran back to the room and slammed the door. I started tearing the place apart. I looked for anything she might have left behind. I checked the floorboards, the back of the closet, the drawers. Nothing. Then I remembered her Facebook. I'd looked her up once after a fight. I searched for Sarah Miller. It took me an hour of scrolling through profiles until I found a memorial page. There was a photo of her. It was the same girl. The blonde hair, the vacant blue eyes, the same crooked smile. I felt a surge of hope, thinking maybe this was some elaborate stalking situation. Then I read the pinned post. It was a message from her parents, dated 3 years ago. They were commemorating the 3rd anniversary of her death. She had been killed in a head-on collision on a rainy night, months before she was even supposed to start her freshman year of college. The car had been crushed so badly they had to identify her by her dental records. The post described the accident in horrific detail. It mentioned how the engine block had been pushed into the front seat, pinning her down. They talked about the metallic, rusted scent of the scene, the way the air around the wreckage didn't just smell like gasoline, but like a butcher shop, a raw, wet, iron-thick odor that the father said he could still taste in the back of his throat whenever it rained. I dropped the phone. That smell. I remembered it now. I always thought it was just the old pipes in the dorm or the smell of Sarah's messy eating. But it wasn't. It was that thick, cloying scent of an open wound, stagnant and warm, that had been lingering on her side of the room for months. I stayed in a hotel that night. I couldn't breathe in that room anymore. The air felt too thick, like I was inhaling something invisible and wet. A week later, I went back with my dad to get the rest of my stuff. I was moving out for good. As I was packing up my desk, I noticed something stuck in the crack between the wall and the floorboards on Sarah's side. I reached down and pulled it out. It was a small, gold earring. A simple stud. I recognized it instantly. Sarah had lost it in November, and we'd spent an hour looking for it. I remember her getting frustrated and crying because it was a gift from her grandmother. I held the earring in my palm. It felt unnervingly warm, as if it had just been taken out of someone's ear. As I looked at it, I noticed a tiny, dried fleck of something dark and crusty on the post. It wasn't dirt. It was a piece of dry tissue, a tiny remnant of something that shouldn't have been there. I left the earring on the bare mattress and ran. I didn't look back. I'm living in an apartment now, miles away from that campus. But sometimes, when it's late and the room is quiet, I hear it. I hear the faint, rhythmic vibration of a bass line coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. And every time it rains, my bedroom begins to fill with that suffocating, raw smell, the scent of something that's been torn open and left to sit in the heat. I don't look at my old Instagram stories anymore. I'm too afraid of what I might see if I look closely at the background. I'm afraid that the distortion isn't a glitch anymore. I'm afraid it's getting clearer.
Next story.
I still have the textbook. It's sitting on my nightstand right now, a thick, cloth-bound thing called Structural Foundations of the Post-War Era. I can't bring myself to throw it away, but I can't look at it for too long either. Every time I catch a glimpse of that faded blue cover, I get this sick, hollow sensation in the pit of my stomach, like I'm looking at a photograph of a dead relative who never actually existed. It started in my junior year. I needed an easy elective to pad out my credits, and history of architecture, the unseen city, seemed like a perfect fit. The lectures were held in the basement of the Wayland Building, a drafty, concrete wing of the campus that most students avoided. I remember the walk down there vividly, the way the fluorescent lights would buzz with a low, irritating hum and the smell of old floor wax and damp drywall. Dr. Eris was the professor. He was a small, brittle-looking man who always wore the same charcoal suit. His skin looked like parchment stretched too tight over a skull, and he had these pale, watery eyes that never seemed to blink. He wasn't exactly friendly, but he was brilliant. He talked about buildings not as piles of stone and steel, but as living organisms that shaped the people inside them. He spoke about blind spots in design, spaces where the human eye just naturally glides over, creating pockets of reality that no one ever truly notices. There were maybe 12 of us in that class. We'd sit in these uncomfortable wooden desks, scribbling notes while Eris paced in front of a chalkboard that always seemed to be covered in dusty, complex diagrams of staircases that led nowhere in rooms with no doors. I remember the scratch of his chalk. It was a rhythmic, aggressive sound that set my teeth on edge. At the end of the semester, I handed in my final paper on the psychology of enclosed spaces. Eris took it from me with a skeletal hand, his fingers cold as a refrigerated coin. He gave me a B+. I saw the grade on the printed slip he handed back during the last week. I felt good about it. I moved on. A year later, I was applying for an internship at a local firm. They needed my official transcripts. When the digital file arrived in my inbox, I scrolled through my junior year grades, expecting to see the architecture elective. It wasn't there. I checked again, thinking I'd skipped over it. Nothing. There was just a gap where that 3-credit course should have been. I figured it was a clerical error. The registrar's office is a nightmare, so I walked over there to get it sorted out. The woman behind the desk, a tired-looking lady with bifocals, typed my student ID into her system. She frowned, her eyes scanning the screen. She told me there was no record of me ever taking a class in the Wayland building that year. She said history of architecture hadn't been offered as an elective since the late 90s. I laughed, thinking she was joking. I told her I spent every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 months in that basement. I told her about Dr. Eris. Her expression shifted from professional boredom to a sort of guarded confusion. She told me she'd worked in that office for 20 years and there had never been a faculty member named Eris. I left the office feeling a strange, lightheaded buzzing in my ears. I went straight to the Wayland building. I needed to see the room. I needed to prove to myself that I hadn't lost my mind. I navigated the familiar hallways, passing the vending machines and the janitor's closet, and stopped at the door to room B12. The door was locked. I peered through the small, wired glass window in the center of the door. My heart didn't just skip, it felt like it stopped entirely. Behind the glass wasn't a classroom. It was a storage space, but not a functional one. It was filled from floor to ceiling with rusted metal filing cabinets, broken chairs, and stacks of old, yellowing newspapers. The dust was so thick it looked like gray fur covering everything. There was no chalkboard. There were no wooden desks. There was a thick layer of cobwebs draped over the light fixtures that looked like they hadn't been turned on in a decade. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the basement pressing against my eardrums. I could still smell the faint, lingering scent of Eris's tobacco, a dry, cherrywood smell, but when I inhaled deeply, all I got was the suffocating stench of stagnant air and rot. I ran back to my apartment. I grabbed the textbook from my shelf. I needed something physical, something I could touch. The book was real. It was right there. I flipped through the pages, seeing my own messy handwriting in the margins, the underlining I'd done during those long lectures. I turned to the front of the book to find the introduction written by Dr. Eris. I remembered reading it on the first night of class. It was a 5-page essay on the malleability of the built environment. I opened the cover. My breath hitched. The page where the introduction should have been was there, but it was a blank, blinding white. Not just empty, it was pristine. There was no ink, no indentation from a printing press, nothing. I flipped the page. The next one was blank too. And the next. I started flipping faster, my thumbs blurring the edges of the paper. The entire first chapter was gone. Just hundreds of pages of white, silent paper. Then I hit the middle of the book. The text returned mid-sentence, but the font was different. It looked jagged, like it had been scratched into the paper by a desperate hand. I took the book to the head of the architecture department, Dr. Miller. I was hysterical by this point. I slammed the book on his desk and told him everything. I told him about the basement, the B+, and the man with the watery eyes. Miller looked at me with a pity that felt like a physical weight. He picked up the book and turned to the introduction page I pointed out. He stared at it for a long time. Then he turned the book around so I could see it. "Son," he said, his voice low and steady. "There's nothing here." "I know," I yelled. "It's blank. That's what I'm telling you." He shook his head slowly. "No. I mean there is no page. Look at the binding." I leaned in. The introduction page wasn't a blank sheet of paper. It was a gap in the binding where a page had been surgically removed. But the paper hadn't been torn out. The glue in the spine was smooth, untouched. It was as if the book had been manufactured with the intention of holding a space for something that was never meant to exist. As I was leaving his office, I passed a display case in the hallway, the faculty emeriti wall. It was a collection of grainy, black and white photos of professors from the early 1900s. I stopped dead. In the bottom corner, there was a group photo of the 1924 design board. Standing in the back row was a man in a charcoal suit. He was small, brittle, with pale eyes that seemed to look through the camera and directly into the back of my skull. The caption beneath the photo listed the names. The man in the suit wasn't named Harris. The caption simply read, "Identity unconfirmed, consultant." I went back to that basement one last time at night. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see if the room would change back. The hallway was pitch black, the overhead lights having finally burnt out. I reached the door to B12 and put my hand on the knob. It was cold, so cold it felt like it was sucking the heat right out of my marrow. I didn't open it. I heard something from the other side. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a pencil scratching against paper. A slow, deliberate, rhythmic sound. Scratch. 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 And then a smell began to drift through the gap under the door. It wasn't the smell of old paper or tobacco anymore. It was a sharp, metallic odor. It reminded me of the way a butcher shop smells on a hot day, that raw, iron-rich scent that sticks to the back of your throat and makes you want to gag. It was the smell of something fresh and wet and wrong. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the moonlight, gasping for air that didn't taste like a wound. I still have the B+ slip. I keep it in a drawer, but I don't touch it. Sometimes, when the apartment is quiet, I look at the ink on that slip. It's starting to fade, turning from black to a dull, brownish red. And every morning when I wake up, the textbook on my nightstand is an inch closer to the edge of the table, as if it's trying to find a way back down to the basement. I think Dr. Harris is still grading my work. I think he's waiting for me to come back and finish the final exam. But I know what the final exam is. He told us on the last day, though I didn't understand it then. He said that to truly understand architecture, one must eventually become part of the structure. I've started noticing things in my apartment. A door that stays open an inch wider than I left it. A shadow in the corner of my eye that doesn't have a source. A space between the wall and the floor that seems to be getting deeper. I'm terrified that one day I'll walk into my kitchen and find that the door to my bedroom is gone, replaced by a wall of pristine, blank drywall, leaving me trapped in a room that doesn't exist on any floor plan.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.